12%. That's what passes through the gap. Not through a pipeline. Not through a political agreement that can be renegotiated. When governments change. Through 29 kilometers of open water. Between the Horn of Africa and the southwestern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. The Bab-el-Mandeb Strait. A name most people who depend on it have never heard. A corridor so narrow that a disabled supertanker closes it, without any hostile intent required. Every day, roughly 4 million barrels of crude oil pass through that gap, heading north toward the Suez Canal and the European markets beyond it. Container ships carrying electronics assembled in Vietnam. Grain loaded in Ukraine before the war rerouted everything. Consumer goods whose supply chains span a dozen countries, moving through a corridor thinner than some river crossings, watched from both shores simultaneously by nations. Nations whose interests in what passes through have never fully aligned. Iran sits on the Persian Gulf, on the Strait of Hormuz, on the northern shore of the choke point it has spent decades threatening, and being threatened through. Iran does not sit on the Red Sea. Iranian territory ends approximately 2,500 kilometers from the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait. The geography was always fixed. The presence was not. Satellite imagery of the Eritrean port of Assab began showing changes around 2015. Infrastructure changes that the publicly stated purposes did not explain. Pier extensions sized for vessels beyond commercial necessity. Fuel storage capacity exceeding regional civilian demand. Buildings whose dimensions and positioning made more sense as military facilities than as anything the official record described. Iran has no coastline on the Red Sea. That stopped being entirely true sometime around 2015. A country doesn't spend millions building infrastructure 2,500 kilometers from its nearest coastline for reasons it's willing to discuss publicly. The official explanations arrived in sequence and dissolved in sequence. Humanitarian operations. Iran maintaining a logistics presence to support relief efforts in Yemen, where a catastrophic civil war had been generating refugee flows and civilian casualties since 2015. Partially accurate. Entirely insufficient. Humanitarian operations require warehouse space and fuel storage calibrated to the volume of aid being moved. The infrastructure visible at Assab was calibrated to something else entirely. Pier extensions capable of accommodating vessels whose displacement exceeded any civilian cargo requirement the humanitarian mission could generate. Fuel storage tanks whose capacity made sense only if the vessels being fueled were making longer voyages, more frequently, than aid delivery schedules required. Commercial presence. Iranian commercial shipping maintaining a regional hub to reduce transit costs on trade routes passing through the Red Sea corridor. This explanation dissolves against the specific geography of what was built. Commercial hubs are built where commercial traffic concentrates. Commercial traffic in the Red Sea concentrates at Djibouti, at Aden, at Port Sudan. Assab sits away from those concentration points, in a location whose primary advantage is not commercial efficiency, but positional geometry relative to the strait. Support for Houthi forces in Yemen. True. Documented. Confirmed by weapons shipments intercepted by American and Allied naval vessels across multiple years. But support for a proxy force explains a logistics function, not a permanent military infrastructure investment. You don't build pier extensions and hardened fuel storage to move weapons crates. You build those things when you intend to keep vessels there. The real logic sits underneath all three explanations simultaneously. When the Strait of Hormuz is threatened or closed, global pressure on Iran concentrates at one point. One choke point. One geographic argument. A second hand on a second choke point changes that calculation completely. Nobody announces the construction of a military facility they intend to deny having built. Eritrea was not a random selection from a map of willing partners. It was the result of a specific convergence of desperation and opportunity. Iran understood how to exploit this before anyone else moved to prevent it. Eritrea sits under permanent international sanctions. Its government has no meaningful Western relationships to protect. It has no economic alternatives significant enough to make Iranian partnership costly. A nation with nothing to lose from association with Iran and a coastline in exactly the right position is not a partner. It is a transaction. Iran offered what Eritrea needed. Eritrea offered what Iran needed. The details of that exchange have never appeared in any public document. Construction began under commercial cover so thin it was nearly transparent. It was so useful it didn't need to be opaque. Civilian contractors. Civilian vessels delivering materials. Port development framed as economic modernization of an underdeveloped coastal facility. The framing required no sophisticated deception. Nobody with the authority to stop it was positioned to intervene. This was before the critical infrastructure was already in place. The pier extensions at Asab were built to accommodate vessels drawing 9 to 10 meters. That draft specification eliminates most commercial cargo configurations. It matches the displacement profile of Iranian naval vessels in the frigate and logistics ship categories. These vessels form the operational backbone of Iranian blue water ambitions. Fuel storage capacity on site reaches volumes that sustain extended naval deployments. This capacity is rather than for commercial port operations. The positioning of hardened structures relative to the waterline follows military facility logic. It places critical systems away from direct line-of-sight exposure from the water approach. None of this appears in any Eritrean Port Authority filing. None of it required any filing to exist. The construction happened in the open. It was documented by satellites nobody could stop from passing overhead. It was deniable because denial costs nothing when admission costs everything. A naval base 2,500 kilometers from home changes nothing until the moment it changes everything. Without a permanent presence in the Red Sea, Iranian naval operations beyond the Persian Gulf required vessels to deploy from home ports on the Iranian coastline. They transit the Arabian Sea, round the Horn of Africa, and enter the Red Sea. This journey consumes significant fuel, crew endurance, and maintenance intervals before reaching the operational area. The logistics chain that sustained any meaningful presence at that distance was long enough to be fragile. It was expensive enough to be episodic rather than continuous. Iran could send ships. It could not keep them there. Asab compresses that equation into something operationally meaningful. A vessel repositioning from Asab to the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait covers less than 300 kilometers. Fuel topped up from on-site storage. Crew rotated through shore facilities. Maintenance conducted without the vessel returning to Iranian waters. The base doesn't multiply Iranian naval power. It repositions it. And repositioned power at a choke point is categorically different from equivalent power sitting 2,500 kilometers away. The Houthi campaign against Red Sea shipping began in late 2023. It demonstrated the concept without requiring Iranian vessels to appear visibly in the operational area at all. Missile and drone attacks on commercial shipping were launched from Yemeni territory. These attacks disrupted traffic through the Bab-el-Mandeb sufficiently to reroute vessels around the Cape of Good Hope. This rerouting added 14 days and significant cost to voyages that previously transited the strait without consideration. The operation required targeting intelligence, weapons resupply, and operational coordination. The logistics infrastructure at Asab was positioned to support this without generating the visible Iranian military signature. Direct naval involvement would have created such a visible signature. Operation Prosperity Guardian was the American-led naval coalition assembled to protect Red Sea shipping. It revealed the strategic architecture Iran had constructed. The response required was scaled to something larger than a proxy militia acting independently. It is not a naval base. It is a second hand on a choke point clock. The piers are real. The fuel storage is real. The strategic geometry that made Asab worth whatever Iran paid Eritrea to access it is real. It is visible on any map showing both the Iranian coastline and the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait simultaneously. The base functions. It supports what it was built to support. It repositioned Iranian reach into a waterway that Iranian territory has never touched. Iranian diplomacy could never have accessed it through legitimate means. Eritrea is still there. That is the first problem the base cannot solve. Eritrea has changed alignments before. It has renegotiated relationships that appeared settled when the underlying economic calculation shifted. A partner whose cooperation was purchased rather than earned through shared interest is a partner whose cooperation has a price. That price can be outbid. The United States, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the broader coalition have resources dwarfing anything Iran can sustain. Iran's supply line stretches 2,500 kilometers. The base exists because nobody has yet offered Eritrea a compelling reason to make it stop existing. That condition is not permanent. The Iranian naval vessels the base was built to support are aging. Maintenance conducted 2,500 kilometers from Iranian shipyards cannot fully address this. Iran's blue water naval ambitions have consistently exceeded its capabilities. Strategic positioning alone cannot close this gap. A well-located base extends the reach of a capable fleet. It cannot substitute for one. The Houthi campaign demonstrated the concept, but also revealed its limits. Global shipping adapted. Insurance markets repriced Red Sea transits. Vessels rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope and absorbed the additional cost. They preferred this over accepting the risk. The disruption was real and expensive. It was not decisive. The choke point was pressured without being closed. Pressure without closure is a negotiating tool, not a strategic outcome. The base survived. The strategy it serves remains incomplete. Two choke points are under simultaneous pressure from a nation controlling neither directly. This nation operates through proxies whose reliability is contingent. Its infrastructure tenure depends on a partner with its own interests and appetite for risk. The architecture is sophisticated. The foundations are not. Was this strategic brilliance dressed in operational secrecy, or the most elaborate overcorrection to geographic disadvantage in modern naval history? The Red Sea doesn't answer. It just moves what passes through it, tide by tide, through water that never agreed to become a theater of someone else's ambitions.